Welcome to Refuting Rationality, the show where we refute the YouTube atheist Rationality Rules. In today's episode, Mr. Rationality is taking on irreducible complexity. Let's begin.
So what exactly does irreducible complexity mean? That would be a good place to start, right? And what exactly would be a good example of something that's irreducibly complex? Well, to quote Behe, the man who coined the term in the first place, irreducible complexity is just a fancy phrase I use to mean a single system which is composed of several interacting parts, and where the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to cease functioning. To illustrate such a system, he goes on to use the example of a mousetrap. A traditional mousetrap is composed of 5 interacting parts: the base, the catch, the spring, the hammer, and the hold down bar, and all of these parts must be in place for the mousetrap to function. Critically, he emphasises, the removal of just one piece causes the system to cease functioning. Behe then goes on to explain that certain biological systems, such as the human eye, are also irreducibly complex, and that due to their irreducible complexity, and this is where the real assertion is being made, they could not have evolved via small modifications through natural selection. However, for the purposes of clarity, let's present this argument in a syllogistic form. Irreducible complexity can only be created by an intelligent designer. The human eye is irreducibly complex. Hence, an intelligent designer must have created the human eye. Therefore, God exists.
Alright, now he did something here he also did in his last video, but I didn't notice it until I started doing this video. And that is, in the syllogism that he made himself, he used 2 conclusions. His first conclusion is, hence an intelligent designer must have created the human eye. Then he adds a second conclusion of therefore God exists. This is an unnecessary conclusion for the intelligent design argument. There are intelligent design advocates that argue for intelligent design without arguing for God. But of course, atheists do realize that if life was intelligently designed, it would have to be by God. And while that may be true, it does not excuse Mr. Rationality for using 2 conclusions. It actually sounds like begging the question, because he made the syllogism himself. Would he have claimed to find all the errors that he claims to have found if he just didn't include that second conclusion? If he could have, then why did he feel the need to include it? That being said, he does have me at a disadvantage on this one since I have not read Darwin's Black Box, but I am confident I do not need to refute his arguments.
So, in debunking this argument, where shall we start? How about with the fact that it commits a special pleading fallacy? A special pleading fallacy occurs when someone attempts to exempt something from a rule or principle without justifying why that something is an exception. And in the case of the argument from irreducible complexity, this something is God. If one is to accept that the human eye must have been created by a designer, then surely a force or being capable of deliberately creating such a system would itself be infinitely more irreducibly complex, and therefore must have also had a designer.
First of all, what is infinitely irreducibly complex supposed to mean? Go ahead and explain that to me in the comments if you can. What exactly is infinitely irreducibly complex? How would that even work? Second, who said God was irreducibly complex, or even designed? Third, the argument from irreducible complexity is an argument against naturalism. It is not specifically for any kind of God. It can be used for most, if not any kind of God, but that's not what it's made for. Its primary purpose is debunking evolution. It shows how evolution is not possible through natural processes. You would need somebody guiding it, even if it was actually true. So the intelligent design argument could even be used to argue for theistic evolution. And trying to call it a special pleading fallacy is just a red herring to distract from his inability to justify his worldview.
The second flaw I'll expose is that the argument from irreducible complexity is yet just another religious argument from ignorance. If we were to grant the assertion that certain biological systems could not have evolved via small modifications through natural selection, all this would do is discard natural selection as a potential answer. It wouldn't lend any credence, and it certainly wouldn't prove that an intelligent designer must have created such systems. That's seriously not how logic works.
This coming from a guy who not only will label a conclusion a premise, but will use two conclusions in one of his syllogisms. People in glass houses should not throw stones. And as I stated earlier, the point of the intelligent design argument is to debunk evolution. I mean, irreducible complexity. I forgot for a second what we were arguing. It is not meant by itself to point to a specific God, only to point away from fallacious philosophies such as evolution, or at least naturalistic evolution. And he never even justified his claim that it was an argument from ignorance. He's really stretching with that one.
And this fact brings us to another fallacy committed by the argument from irreducible complexity, that of the black and white. The subtle but overwhelming assertion that this argument makes is that only one of two conclusions can account for irreducible complexity, that being natural selection or intelligent design. But it doesn't substantiate why these two conclusions are the only possibilities. To illustrate how absurd this assertion is, consider the following more obvious black and white fallacy. If I were to assert that the Earth either orbits around Mars or it orbits around Uranus, and then asserted that it doesn't orbit around Uranus and therefore must revolve around Mars, I'd have committed a black and white fallacy akin to the one made by the argument from irreducible complexity.
The reason his example is obviously black and white fallacy is because we can name other possibilities. How exactly would you go about justifying that the Earth can either orbit Mars or Venus? You couldn't, because any attempt to justify such a ridiculous statement would inadvertently offer other options, such as orbiting the Sun or orbiting nothing. An example he should have gave was of a dichotomy similar to either natural selection or intelligent design, and then justify that. Go on, show us how it's done. In the meantime, if you make a claim of a black and white fallacy, it is your responsibility to justify that claim. Present the third option. If not intelligent design or natural selection, then what? I guarantee you, anything you say will fit into one of those two categories.
But let's now get to what is in my opinion the most irritating flaw that this argument commits. Like the vast majority of intelligent design arguments, it ignores and or misrepresents evolution by natural selection. Behe's assertion that natural selection cannot account for certain biological systems is flat out nonsense. If we take the eye alone, which is arguably the poster boy for irreducible complexity, we actually know a great deal about its evolution. If you're seriously interested in learning how the eye evolved, I've put a few links in the description to some of Dawkins' work, but for what it's worth, here's a brief synopsis. The most basic of eyes are called eye spots, and they're found in even single-celled organisms such as Euglena. These eye spots are essentially photoreceptive proteins that can sense light and shadows but can't form an image. And while they might be crude, they nevertheless provide a massive advantage for detecting the lights of predators. Cup eyes, which can be found in organisms such as planarian worms, are basically a curved sheet of eye spots that due to their curvature possess the capacity to detect the direction of light and shadows, which obviously is a huge improvement to eye spots. Pin eyes, which are found in organisms such as the nautilus, are the result of cup eyes progressively curving to make a circle, which enables the organism to see distinct but blurry images. And lens eyes, which organisms such as the human possess, are pin eyes that have evolved a transparent sphere of gunge at the pin of the eye, which focuses light beams by means of refraction. This might sound like a big jump, but to quote Dawkins, to get a really good image you do need a decently curved lens, but any old bit of gunge which is transparent will do, if it's just approximately curved. Hence, not only do we know that biological systems such as the eye can evolve by natural selection, we actually have different stages of eye evolution in living organisms.
And now he's begging the question. He's basically assuming evolution happened in order to prove that evolution happened. For instance, all those examples of eyes he gave, every one of those eyes are themselves irreducibly complex. On the surface, it may seem like he made a good point, and this may be his strongest argument for this, but all he's done is show different types of eyes and claim that there are different stages of evolution. Just like when atheists claim to know how a star was formed because they see what they claim is different stages of star progression in the universe. They are begging the question. To better clarify irreducible complexity, let's move away from the eyeball and look at a whole system, rather than just the eyeball, which, let's face it, animals do not need eyes to survive. Eyeballs only help survival, doesn't guarantee it. But a brain and heart are both necessary, and trying to evolve both of them is a catch-22, times 4. The brain needs the nutrients that the blood provides, given by the heart, but the heart needs the brain in order to pump. Furthermore, in order for the blood to get from the heart to the brain, you need blood vessels and capillaries. And for the brain to send messages to the heart, you need a nervous system. This isn't even taking into consideration the respiratory system or the digestive system. All of these systems in the human body are irreducibly complex and could not have evolved piece by piece.
And finally, as the last flaw that I'll cover in this video, and one that directly follows from the argument ignoring and or misrepresenting natural selection, is that it commits a personal incredulity fallacy. Behe's assertion that certain biological systems cannot be the product of small modifications via natural selection is an admission that he is ignorant of a topic that he wrote an entire book about, which, if I'm honest, is kinda sad. If one doesn't understand something, this doesn't mean that this thing is invalid. So,
or maybe you just don't understand irreducible complexity.